Welcome everybody to the first NCFS Unbound of the 2023 to 2024 academic year, I guess. So excited for this turnout and for the upcoming conversation. So we are so glad to have Holly Dugan with us today. She is the Director of English Graduate Studies and an Associate Professor of English at the George Washington University. Her research focuses on early modern English literature and culture, especially histories of the senses, embodiment, sexuality, and critical animal studies. She's the author of The Ephemeral History of Perfume, Scent and Sense in Early Modern England from 2011, Johns Hopkins University Press, and co-editor with Karen Raber of the Routledge Handbook of Shakespeare and Animals from 2020. She has written numerous articles on smell in early modern culture, including most recently, Festering Lilies, Seeing and Smelling Gender and Race in Early Modern Poetry in Literature and the Senses, from Oxford University Press, 2023. And she's currently finishing a book about Shakespeare, performance history, and the senses. So she will be interviewing Cheryl Krueger. If you've been mispronouncing her last name this whole time, now's the chance to correct your memory of it. Cheryl Krueger is Associate Professor of French at the University of Virginia. She's a former editor of the journal 19 and former member and chair of the MLA's 19th-Century French division. Her book publications include The Art of Procrastination, Baudelaire's Poetry in Prose from the University of Delaware, Approaches to Teaching Baudelaire's L'Esprit de Paris from MLA, and Perspectives on Teaching Language and Content from Yale University Press. She has given many lectures and conference papers on topics related to the culture of French perfume, which we have all enjoyed immensely, often at NCFS and SDN, and not long ago at the interdisciplinary colloquium Le Parfumeur at the Versailles Palace. Her interest in the intertwining cultures of literature and perfume in 19th century France is reflected in several articles published in the US, the UK, and France, including the special 2017 issue of Littérature entitled Sociabilité du Parfum, edited Jean-Alexandre Perras and Erica Wicki. Today, she will talk about her new book, Perfume on the Page in 19th Century France from University of Toronto Press, 2023. And we have a discount code, which we'll put in the chat, Krieger 25. So everyone will want this book on their shelves, not just for what's inside, but for the absolutely beautiful cover. And so I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl and Holly.
Before I begin, I just wanted to thank the conference organizers, Masha, Susan, and Rachel, and to mention that this series was a lifeline during the pandemic when it was called NCFS in Chains. And I followed it closely ever since, so I'm especially happy to be able to take part in it. And I wanted to thank 19th Century French Studies and Society of 19e as well, because so much of this book was written as I gave papers at those conferences. And it was the discussions at those conferences that really kept me going. Finally, I have to thank Holly Dugan. I'm so excited that she's going to be interviewing me. If you're interested in this topic, do get her book. It's really wonderful. And thanks everyone for being here at a super busy time of year. So, as I think you all know, I'm a specialist in 19th century French literature, and I'm not a historian and I'm not a neuroscientist. But I've always been interested in the scent of perfume. That's another story. And I won't go into the long, winding road that brought me to this book, except to say that I think it had a lot to do with Baudelaire, one of my early interests in literature. And the fact that Baudelaire was being cited in studies in neuroscience, in history, in anthropology, all over the place, for his use of perfume language and his evocation of olfaction. But at the same time, there weren't a lot of people studying olfaction in his poetry. So that's what kind of got me started. So this is the cover of the book, and I thought I would just say something about the cover and the title to begin with. Perfume on the Page is meant to evoke the materiality of perfume, and the fact that I talk a lot about how perfume and language work together. The poster itself is by Alphonse Mucha, and it's a poster of the Lance Parfum Rhoda, which I talk about in chapter 6. And I like the image particularly because it brings together a lot of threads of analysis that I study in this book. It has to do with women, it has to do with words, it has to do with the materiality of perfume. And it's a topic that was motivated by my observation of two paradoxes. One is that in any literature you read about olfaction, there's a discussion about the paucity of olfactory language. But at the same time, a lot of 19th century literature has been praised and criticized for its evocation of perfume. I also noticed, just in my pleasure reading about perfume, how much people like to express themselves in words about perfume. The second paradox is that in the 19th century, the perfume industry really took off in France, and women were encouraged to wear perfume. Advertising was marketed to women, but there was a fear of perfume expressed in literature, especially by medical doctors, but also in beauty manuals and magazines. All of this gets reflected in French literature, and it seems as if perfume becomes the new miasma just as it takes off. So my work is very much informed by other disciplines, including history and chemistry and biology and anthropology, but I really approached the whole thing from the point of view of literature. As my table of contents shows, I did not exactly home in on a chronological approach to chapter topics. I tried to, but I quickly found out that very much like perfume itself, the literary movements and the authors I was studying sort of overlapped. They built on one another. I couldn't really say that romantic literature treats perfume differently than naturalist literature. It was very much a question of the works that I was studying. So instead, I present you this analogy. This is called the perfume pyramid, and you might be familiar with it because perfumers use it to describe how their perfumes are going to work in space. That is, that there'll be a base note that's very, that has heavier molecules, and that these base notes kind of anchor the scent. The heart note is sort of the heart and soul of the scent, what you remember of it usually. And the head notes are what burn off rather quickly. You might encounter them at first, but as you wear a perfume throughout the day, they go away. I should say that a lot of perfumers work against this pyramid on purpose, but it's something that you'll find all over perfume literature. And I kind of saw my book the same way, that the head notes of the book in this analogy are language, how words are working, the discourse about perfume in the 19th century. The heart notes are the women who wear perfume, the women to whom the perfume is marketed, the women who are buying perfume because they're a mobilized consumer base, and finally the base notes. I'm still very interested in what everything smells like. So the introduction is called Something in the Air, and the something that's in the air is sillage. Sillage is a beautiful term for the wake of perfume left in a room after somebody wearing perfume goes away. So perfume is often talked about in terms of longevity, in terms of projection, and in terms of sillage. So longevity means you put the perfume on your wrist and it lasts 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Projection is you're in your little perfume bubble. How close do you have to get to me to smell that perfume? But sillage is what's left behind. And it comes from the term wake, as in a wake on the water. So visually, a sillage is what you see after an action has taken place, after a boat has passed by and left a wake on the water. And sillage is what you smell after the person wearing the perfume has passed by. Whoops, I think I just get to, I'm going in the wrong direction. Sorry. There we go. The first chapter is called In a Violet Sillage. And I use violet, one of the most popular fragrances in the 19th century, as a kind of case study of how there's a codification of perfume going on in the 19th century, but the codification doesn't entirely work. So that characters like Nana, Zola's Nana, the prostitute, wears the same perfume or is associated with the same scent as Virginie in Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's Paul et Virginie. I won't go into much detail on it, but we can talk about it later. The second chapter, The Language of Flowers and Silent Things, is very much devoted to Baudelaire. The third chapter, Confused Words, is where I tried to see if people who wrote about perfume in the 19th century, and that would be perfumers, fiction and poetry writers, and medical doctors, they were doing most of the writing about perfume, if any of them had trouble expressing themselves in words, and if they did, how they handled it. The fourth chapter, The Osmosome of Literature, you might recognize this word from Huysmans. It's a term that he used in A Rebours, and I devote quite a bit of the chapter to his famous perfume chapter. In chapter 5, Perfume Letters, I talk about the exchange of letters and the perfume letters in literature and how it relates to advice to women about perfuming their stationery in the 19th century. In chapter 6, Smelling of Iris, I talk a great deal about Madame Bovary, who smelled of iris, and about how the smell of iris was read in the 19th century. And in Decadent Perfuming, I discussed the cover of the book and some other representations of over-perfuming and perfume abuse in the 19th century. So there's an epilogue in which I kind of open up a discussion of Oriental perfume or exotic perfume. I say Oriental perfume because it's the term that is still used to talk about a fragrance category, but Orientalism and exoticism are really baked into French perfumery. And I talk about that and deal with Rachild's Monsieur Venus. And I'll leave you with this little installation of perfumes that relate obviously to paper. It's one of my short-term installations in my home office. And I'll stop sharing and go to the conversation from there.
Thank you so much. This was delightful. And I am so excited to talk about that perfume installation at the end. I also just wanted to begin by telling you what a beautiful book this was. It was such a delight and a pleasure, especially in this most challenging week. And so I just wanted to thank you for that and for the invitation to be in conversation. For those of you who don't know me, I know Cheryl from way back. We are both fumies, folks who love perfume, both in terms of wearing it as well as talking and studying and thinking about its relationship to language. So this book is a real treat. As well as a provocation. And I think that's where I want to begin. In this book, you show how the so-called limitations of olfactory language in French and also in English are a boon in the 19th century, fueling artistic imagination and enabling authors to develop both a poetics and also narrative structures for perfume. And I really appreciated your argument, your really strong and eloquent argument for the value of humanities-based approaches to scientific and cognitive thinking around olfaction. And as you pervasively and persuasively prove, the paradox of olfactory language, this thing that's often represented as a problem from scientific methodologies, is actually what fuels artistic creativity. And that this convergence is particularly exciting in a moment when the kinds of smells available in the 19th century shift and expand radically. And I'll admit, as somebody who has thought tremendously about the history of perfume, even in my own work, I have set up the 19th century as a kind of straw man of when perfume becomes a commodity and when the linguistic innovation becomes marketed and in some ways deadened. And pushing against that, sort of what happens in this pre-modern moment. And you show really in innovative ways that is just absolutely not true. And so thank you for that. It's, I think, really been inspiring as I take up these claims, again, in my own work. And then I thought maybe we just begin with sillage. it's a really interesting structure for methodology. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. You argue that Perfume offers a method for reading and overtly using the structure of a modern perfume to craft your argument. And I think also to create powerful associative links between the chapters. And I wanted to actually ask you to talk more about this. I wondered if you might begin with this concept of sillage and how it enabled you to transform your own reading practices as well as the structure of your book. And how do you imagine the sillage of the book, its lasting effects, its interventions, as well as its associative surprising pleasures in the minds of your readers?
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm fascinated with the concept of sillage, and I will admit it was my working title for the book until I realized a lot of people didn't know what it meant or how to pronounce it. So it probably wouldn't have worked very well. And what I like about sillage is, so in perfumery, the idea is that you smell a note and you linger with it, and some other notes kind of move through it, and the base notes kind of move through all of those. So there's a sort of temporal and spatial aspect to it. And this kept coming up when I kept trying to divide the literature I was talking about either into chronological categories or maybe smell categories, but it didn't work very well. So violet, for example, was very popular when natural violet was popular, and there were dupes that would make it less expensive. But then it goes crazy when ionone is discovered toward the end of the century, and it's synthesized. And so there's sort of a through line of interest in that perfume in the 19th century. And I think it ends up linked, the literature that features violet ends up being very linked in unusual ways. So when Zola talks about violet at the end of the century in La Faute de l'Abbé Mouret, for example, I see many more connections to Paul et Virginie in the beginning of the century than I do to some of his other smelly literature, like Le Ventre de Paris. And sillage, I noticed, it's a word I took for granted, but I noticed it used for the first time I could find in a medical treatise on hysterics and their relationship to perfume. And this doctor said, he was kind of doing a quick history of perfume, saying, well, now there's no perfume left, everything's synthesized, and all you have to do is stand out on a Paris street and you'll smell the sillage of aristocratic women and demi-mondaine. And he's kind of saying that you can't tell anymore who is who, because the sillage is the same. And it's this negative representation of sillage. So I started looking into it and found that it was coming up in women's magazines and fashion magazines as well, in a positive way. But the word was sort of born already with this negative positive that seems to carry through the whole century. And I think until today, there are very strong negative and positive feelings about perfume even now. Okay, that's part of your question. The sillage of the book. I do hope that people will read the book and then go back to their reading in a different way. So I thought I would do all kinds of less known literature, and that is some really great work to be done. But what I ended up doing was rereading works I already knew and discovering I didn't know them. And it was because I hadn't connected to the smells, which were everywhere in these works. It's not just a little mention here or there. But if you don't know what something smells like, and if you don't know its cultural significance, it becomes kind of a reality effect or something that you can just breeze over in reading. Once you have both the history and the bodily experience, I think it's a very different thing. I know you agree with me.
I do. Oh, and I think that one of the things that was really pleasurable, even as someone who is, familiar with this concept, both, materially in terms of wearing perfume and thinking about perfume, but then also as a critic. I mean, one of the things I think that this reading practice opens up is, you've spoken really beautifully already about what the spatial dynamics of sillage does, which is, why it has this negative connotation is that it's women taking up public space, and that I think even now some of those very visceral understandings of what the norm should be for a public space and who is allowed to fully inhabit that space is something that's worth thinking about. But for me, this reading, especially with the chapter on violet, and its ionic flickering. For those of you who, violet, you probably have a very strong scent memory as well. Violet, it was, most of us do. It's one of those, it's kind of like a grandmom perfume now. It's because it was in lipstick, and you probably have a scent memory of your grandmom trying to kiss you when you were a child and not wanting to be kissed and having all kinds of interesting smell memories. It's like a lipstick perfume note now in contemporary perfumery. But in your chapter, you bring up the flickering of it is that it's never one thing, even in its metaphoric connotations, even for a specific author, and that in some ways it captures not just spatial experience, but also temporal experiences of reading, which again, I think there are very few metaphors that really open up that dynamic of pleasure of reading, and that occurs across time as a metaphor builds and becomes a central conceit or a trope. For me, the violet as a scent marker in your reading of it really opens up this profoundly different way of thinking about reading experience. Do you have any thoughts about that? Was that something you were thinking about?
I was definitely thinking about both the temporal and spatial aspects of sillage. And when you think of a person in an elevator, leaves the elevator, you go in, the sillage is there, time has passed. It's not just that it's space, but time has passed as well. And I think that for the reader, these odors bring a connection between literatures of different times and different spaces as well. It also problematizes the codification of various odors. The 19th century really wanted to codify these odors according to quality, according to hair color, according to ethnicity. It was a century when museums were being built full of organizational rooms that had to do with human beings, organizing human beings in various ways. There are medical doctors who write about perfume and the sense of humans and break it down to what part of France people are from and how they're going to smell if they're from that part of France. So there is also this whole social aspect of it, but it can be, it's constantly undermined actually in a lot of these books that seem to be trying to rely on these signifiers, these perfumes as signifiers, but it doesn't always work. But sillage is also, I was going to say, it's very scary because it's something personal that's being projected on others. And when you breathe, you smell. You take in smells. There's really no way around it. You can close your eyes to something you don't want to see. You can close your ears to something you don't want to hear, but you can't really breathe without smelling what's around you. And so the fact that women were asserting themselves in this way, apparently some wearing too much perfume, it gets talked about all the time, was seen as very assertive and maybe even aggressive and dangerous.
I love that. I think this is also, we can't talk about this book without talking about these amazing images. And so my next question is going to pull us towards that direction. I think one of the surprising associations for me across the chapters as I was reading it is the intrasensorial connections you're making. Even, again, we talk about things in using metaphors for smell to describe that experience as a loud perfume, these intrasensorial connections. But you've really shown the semiotics of perfume alongside of the poetics as well. And so I thought we could talk more about that. Can you discuss some of these fabulous images that you're including and how they're serving as evidence, both in terms of some of the images from high art, how we might describe it as, again, artistic traditions that are designed for artistic mediums versus advertising, and so many of these images are showing, I think, perfume in motion. That's such a, I think that's one of, thinking about the poetics of perfume in motion has enabled me to now see in some of these, standard tropes, the images that I've seen quite a few times in, as a fan of perfume and also as a scholar of it, and I see them anew. So I'm curious about that. Did you see an intersensorial connection here as well? And what would you say about the semiotics of perfume in relationship to the poetics?
Well, and definitely for the images, so many images in the 19th century, and I can't really speak. I mean, there are some of other centuries I know, but I won't go too deeply there. Do show perfume happening, So, and I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is that there has always been a synesthetic language about perfume in literature long before the 19th century, and it continues today. Also in the 19th century, the pervasive theory of smell reception was a vibration theory, which was like a wave theory, like a sound theory. So things going through the air, vibrations going through the air that you could represent on paper, in a scientific paper, for example, that would hit your nose and cause you to understand what smell came in. We use shape theory today more often. I won't get into that, but you probably know all about it. And some people disagree with that still. But so in a way, I think some of these, and it's funny because I think I have another really nice example somewhere. Oh yeah, well, this woman is writing a letter. And by the way, look how big this is. This woman is writing a letter, and you can see the wafts of perfume from her perfume burner in the room. And so in perfume advertising, of course, it's meant to show that the perfume has some staying power, that it's there, that it will last, that it's good, focus on the product. But I think that in other types of images, it can have a more negative perception, which is that it's something in the air. It's something in the air that shouldn't be in the air. It's like a miasma. Most of my images do, though, I just have a whole bunch of props here. They tend to come from advertising. What's interesting about this one is, though, that isn't liquid. It's vapor. This is a perfume that was made in an ether base. And when you popped open the little capsule, the ether and the perfume came out, and people actually got high on it for years until it was
that part of the book fascinating. But the image reminds me of a pietà as well. I feel like there's some ways in which the semiotics of perfume and the poetics of perfume is really engaging with these very long established artistic tropes and rendering them anew through its own materiality and investment. So hopefully we can come back to that in a second, but I don't think we can talk about this book without thinking about what you named as the heart, as its heart, which is women and gender, and it's how gender is functioning as a category of analysis. And you show, you've undersold, I think, one of the most important provocations that your book offers, which is this idea of the male sniff, which is linked to but different from what we might describe as the male gaze. And so here smell really does re-engage, the poetics of smell re-engages this category of gender and renders it anew, even though we are very familiar with some of the ways in which it's operating in other sensory modalities. And you suggest that reading and smelling in the 19th century are analogous activities involving imaginative possibilities and harnessing the temporality, the context, and the unique individuated properties of specific molecules or odorants. And as you also argue, this didn't necessarily disrupt gendered patterns already embedded in literary tropes. And so I really found this phrase, the male sniff, to capture a sinister as well as potentially the pleasures of perfume, and that middling melange, that how it troubles, I think, some of the ways in which we approach gender and power And I think you show really eloquently that the syntax of olfactory language is a syntax of power. And so I wondered if we could talk more about that. It challenges, but it also reinforces gender norms. How are you thinking about gender in the poetics of perfume, and how are women authors maybe thinking about it in this period as well?
Yeah, I looked at a lot of male authors because their literature is so rich in perfume references having to do with women. And that's kind of where the male sniff came from. They are kind of creating a way to smell women, a way to interpret that smell. And these are authors like Balzac, like Zola, Goncourt, Flaubert, Baudelaire, and they often will have a character who goes against the grain a little bit. So, for example, Nana adopts a violet perfume. Now, violet perfume had been a perfume, it had been a scent associated with chaste women for a long time. And she becomes a very high-paid courtesan for a short time, living in this magnificent mansion that just reeks of violet. So she overuses it. So there's a sort of comment on her lack of taste. It's amazing what experts these authors became on perfume. And she also kind of rebrands it. It becomes Nana's perfume. She's a real influencer at the time. So there are levels going on within these stories as well. There are women like Rachilde and Renée Vivien who are associated with perfume and violet in different ways. So Vivien was called La Muse aux Violettes. So she kind of associated herself with violet. And then her disruptive public presence disrupted what violet would be like. What Rachilde seems to do in Monsieur Venus is to parody a lot of these tropes, to play them up to the maximum. And Monsieur Venus is a text where there's all kinds of gender switching. And so she has the characters switching which perfumes they're wearing, and sort of over-representing the exoticism of perfumes in those rooms. But I think what I would really love to be able to find is more from bourgeois women who are wearing perfume, because they were the ones who were being targeted as buyers. And I'd love to hear their voices a little bit more. And I think that's a kind of next step that interests me a lot. To figure out who is working in the industry. Are they talking about it? I didn't really get that far in this book, but it fascinates me because still, I think a lot of the women authors who are writing about perfume are writing in the sillage of some male authors, are writing against them. And so it becomes a very literary act.
Yes. There's a great question in the chat that I want us to get to, but I feel like there's a lot of questions here about where that archive would be and how the history of perfume also connects. So in my time period, again, there's an opportunity still for women to assemble and create their own through culinary traditions. It hasn't yet been identified as a chemistry and a science that can be really guarded and requiring professional expertise. Like the IFF now is like very hard to interact with them because of how guarded they are around some of these compositions. And I think, again, you're getting to sort of that question of what the everyday language of scent is and how we interact with it. But I do want to make some space for the great question in the chat, which has to do with a relationship to two parts of your pyramid of method, which is the odorants themselves, the language we use about it, and then that sort of the heart of this of gendered tropes. And it's asking questions about colonial power, about orientalizing discourse, and even about the material practices of colonialism that is bringing and importing all of these quote unquote exotic the power of perfume resides in the material itself, but it's also harnessed and sold by those who are from a different geopolitical location. And that sort of separation is the project of capital, as you sort of show in the epilogue, and still is with us in the contemporary language we use to describe its effects of exoticizing, opium. You just have to take a tour through. You don't even have to go to a fancy department store to sort of see its legacies at work. But unfortunately, even the niche stuff sometimes engages with this as well.
Very much.
Really kind of gross racialized colonialist discourse. How do you take that up in your epilogue? Can you speak to that colonial legacy?
Yes, there is, you can sense in a lot of the perfumers' manuals a kind of cognitive dissonance about this, because especially after the Franco-Prussian War, there is this need to make perfume very French. It becomes part of the whole national image. It always was before as well, but you sense a lot of speaking against German perfumers, for example, who make all the synthetic perfume. And then a lot of references to products that are made in France, insisting that a lot of our products are made in France, and the roses that we can grow are better than the ones that we can buy elsewhere. And I think there's a book to be written on this, to really look at where most of the products were not coming from France. Obviously, the resins could not have been coming from France. The ambergris couldn't have been coming from France. Some of the flowers, yes, jasmine and rose. But it would be wonderful to look into that and to see, to sort of compare where these were coming from with how the perfumers, because every perfume manual, not every, most tend to be related to a perfume house. And so there's a certain amount of publicity going on there. To sort of see how they dance around this question would be fascinating. So I really hope there are scholars out there ready to take it on. There's a world to be discovered on this topic.
I will definitely, I think my final question as a director of graduate studies is about graduate students. So we'll get to that, but there are two fabulous questions in the chat that I want to, and I think they're linked. And so I thought I hope I can take this liberty. Please forgive me if I'm not doing justice to your question and re-ask it. But for now, I want to think a bit more. There's a question about men and perfume wearing. And so I think both questions are in some ways related to gendered consumption of perfume, both in terms of these highly stylized poetic semiotics, but also in terms of everyday use of wearing. So the first has to do with men wearing perfume. And I think you speak to that, sometimes the prurient associations that can accrue for this kind of fixation on smell. And then the second has to do with hysteria. And how smell as a middling sense is potentially, both bridging that gap between religious, epiphany and all of the transcendent pleasure it can offer, but also that really animal-like danger that could potentially mobilize fears of hysteria, of imaginative disorders and disabilities. Can you speak to either of those?
Yeah, and they're
about
kind
gender?
of related too, because hysteria is such a gendered diagnosis. And so men who are associated with hysteria are called effeminate in the literature. And before the 19th century, men and women were wearing perfume. Well, first of all, real perfume was being worn by the aristocracy, and it was men and women. And it's the advertising, and I guess a lot of the discourse, the medical discourse as well, starts to de-emphasize wearing perfume for men and suggesting they just wear eau de cologne. And then the dandy starts to be associated with floral perfumes. And so there's a whole lot going on with men as well. And I decided not to split the book in half because I had so much to do with women, but there's a lot going on with gender. There is a lot of erotic literature and popular literature that associates heavy perfume wearing with homosexuality and lesbianism. You find it in all kinds of, suggested in all kinds of works and then featured in some works. Sophie Valentine-Morlot is about to come out with a book where she has a chapter on perfume and the inverti, and she reads all kinds of works that are lesser known and discovers this whole world of tropes about perfume and gender that I didn't deal with in this book. Yeah, there is a real funneling of men and women into two separate camps of perfume wearing, and not more than two separate camps in the 19th century.
Let's talk about one of those, which is the extreme end of perfume consumption that you talk about. Again, the vapor, I think, could have got to that as well. I think that's why it's on your cover, as this radical potential to take something that is represented as a gendered norm to an extreme that thereby thwarts its logic. And I think you show that power in really interesting ways about what it might mean to want to, inject perfume and to really transform your corporeal presence through this medium. There's a great question in the chat that's even about this: is there any kind of way in which perfume is thought to interact in particular ways, in an individuated way, with the wearer, rather than something that is, again, just put on? Is there an idea that, individuality can be expressed chemically through this subject? I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that extreme consumption of perfume and wearing.
Yeah, but I didn't see anything about, in the 19th century, I didn't see anything about anything but wearing as an identity marker. I am this kind of woman because I wear rose, I'm this kind of woman because I wear violet. But there was a lot of talk about ingestion of perfume in various ways, including drinking it, because it was made in drinkable alcohol for quite a while. And injecting, and there are stories of perfume injection in France and in England, and then they come to the US, that are, I think, overblown, but people are very interested in this idea that a woman would inject perfume into her blood and then would exhale perfume. I never read a firsthand account from a woman. I have only read reports from men on this. And it ties into the idea of, it ties into hysteria and hysterical women being overly interested in perfume and overly sensitive to perfume. And it ties into the idea of women being excessive in general, going too far with things that give them pleasure. And so it comes up all the time in both in medical literature and in literature fiction, and to a certain extent in beauty manuals. But the beauty manuals always hold back just a little bit. They're a little more conservative usually.
Super interesting. I mean, it's a pattern that I think historically just reiterate. I've written about a perfume craze for scented gloves and all of the panic that emerges around women consuming these scented gloves in the early 17th century. It's that sort of again, it's this temporal and spatial intervention into the space-time of capital that can, that gives perfume its power, but also makes it radically unstable as a commodity, even when it's in its most gendered norm.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, speaking of women in hysteria, there's a doctor in the US in 1877 who had a patient who smelled of violet when she was having a hysterical episode. And he actually used a handkerchief. He actually distilled perfume made from her sweat and passed it around at a conference. And it's amazing reading the conference report, which is detailed, where it goes around the room and all the men say, "Oh, it really smells like violet. It really does." It struck me, first of all, that they all knew what violet smelled like. I don't know that everybody does. But and that got recorded in France as well. So these stories go back and forth, that a hysterical woman can actually exhale a perfume naturally, that she shouldn't be.
Yes. I mean, I think, again, I don't want to take us to our medieval modern roots, but it's definitely has that air of sanctity, that sort of sense of what a transformed body, a different kind of corporeal experience. How do you manifest that, and how do you describe it, and how do you represent it? So there's two great questions. I want to finish, but I think we have to ask, since it's perfume on the page, I do want to ask you about book history and paper. If you ever have the joy or pleasure of going to the Osmothèque, which is a museum of perfumery in Versailles, I highly recommend you go. They have great public programming. But one of the things that's interesting about perfume history is that they do not let you wear their recreations on skin. You have to encounter perfume on paper. And the history of perfume then is encountered through this medium of paper. And so I wondered if you could talk more about perfume on the page and how this potentially has a connection to book history, to historiography, to our understanding of the history of the body.
Well, Rimmel famously released the first edition of his book of perfumes as a scented book. I would love to have smelled it. I don't know what it looks like. And perfume cards were used as advertising, and they were scented and handed around, and you can find those on eBay and Del Camp, but they don't have any odor anymore. But in the 19th century, women were encouraged to use scented bookmarks, so that if you gave your book to a friend and the friend smelled it, the friend would always think of you. The women wore paper flowers as well, and those would be scented with perfume. I think that, so that's in a very literal way that I see perfume on the page, but I think that in another way, words and books have been perfume's best friend for a very long time. And even not looking at literature, but just looking at the way people who love perfume talk about perfume, if you look at all of the websites, or Turin and Sanchez's book, the Book of Perfumes, where they write reviews that are little vignettes of what it's like to smell them, you just realize that perfume provokes an outpouring of writing. And it's fun to try to describe a perfume. I've done it many, many times. It really stretches your writerly imagination.
It really does. I share that appreciation. I'm not so good at writing it, but I definitely do love
Good at it, but I love doing it. It's really fun.
There's a great question about the intersensorial connections between food and perfume, especially the gustatory cuisine culture. How does this history intersect with some others that your readers might be more familiar with, more broadly connections between perfume and food, cuisine, gastronomy, especially with that image of the cooked apples that you have in your epilogue?
With the image of the cooked apples, the funny thing is that, that the cooked apples are being presented as the opposite of a perfume. They're lowly, they're overcooked, they're smelly. It's so interesting that gourmand perfumes are so popular today. A gourmand, as Holly knows, a gourmand perfume is a perfume with a foodie scent, not just vanilla, which has been in perfume forever, but apple, chocolate, coffee, all kinds of things. There is a real connection that I don't know very much about, in that ambergris, for example, is edible and was used in food flavoring. I am not actually sure how much in the 19th century. I think it might have been more before that. And there are, certain other ingredients like vanilla that you can both smell and use in cuisine. But I think I would have to ask an expert like Michael Garvel to talk about cuisine.
Really, if he asked that question.
Is he the one? I think he should answer that one. He knows all about it.
I hope I did it justice, but we'll have more time, I'm told, after this recording stops to follow up. I shared this as well, so I'm going to ask this recent question about the relationship to music and smell. And was there a more systematic approach to synesthesia, symbolism, impressionism in the late 19th century? And I think this person is thinking about that image you showed of the scale of confused words, and sort of how chords kind of connect to some of these attempts to represent smell in language.
It's so fascinating. These perfumers decided to, especially Pièce, but not only Pièce, to catalog their perfumes as notes on the scale. that would harmonize if you played the right notes together. They didn't actually create a perfume organ that played notes or played perfume or anything like that. But it's interesting because I have not seen any evidence that they were musical people other than this. So to me, again, it is a kind of language. They are creating a way to sight read a perfume recipe by looking at the chord that they've written out on the page and saying, okay, I don't have to pull all my samples up and smell them on paper. I just know that these are going to go together in this way. And I'm going to call that the key of C. And these will go together in the key of F. It's really interesting. It's a way of being able to communicate among perfumers. And I think music makes sense because harmony is something you want in the perfume blend. Because of the idea of traveling in the air, music traveling to your ears and smells traveling to your nose. So it's a really nice analogy. I never think of perfume and music, though. It's funny. I think of perfume and touch. To me, all of my relationships to smell have to do with they're velvety, they're silky, they're cold.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have to think more about that. I know I definitely have a few screechy perfumes that I kind
Yes.
of love
Oh, yeah,
for that reason, but they're special. You have to wear
and
them.
loud, of course, loud.
And I hope, I think we're going to end at 3. So with the 4 minutes that I have left, I hope I'm not the only, I'm going to shift gears. I'm a critic, but I'm also a perfume lover. And so I'm going to ask the fumey questions for anybody else who is a perfume fan in the room. Do you have scent recommendations to accompany some of the work that you're doing in this? And if you're new to smell, if you're a graduate student who hasn't thought about smell and they want to engage more deeply with the arguments you're making about violet, about carrion, and other scents, iris, do you have scent recommendations that they could easily find that could provide a nice starting point for thinking more deeply about smell?
Oh, if you want to know what these things really smell like, yes. Go to the department store for the iris chapter and try Prada's Infusion d'Iris, infusion of iris. It's a really nice kind of a clean iris smell that makes me think Madame Bovary would have quite liked that for her linens. Other iris smells can be a little leathery. There's the Penteligons that's very leathery and probably not quite what I'm talking about, but it's called Iris Prima, I think. It's supposed to be like a ballet shoe. For violet, Caron is really famous for violet smelling makeup and perfumes, so Violette Précieuse. But for my chapter, this is harder to find. I talk about how Zola brings in violet and musk together, so a certain dirtiness with the cleanness of violet. There's a perfume called Let Me Be the Lion, Shakespeare, but it's by a Swiss company called Les Nez, the noses, like the perfumers, and it's got a yummy violet leaf, kind of a grittier violet leaf.
Love it.
Or if you don't know what you can call what an oriental perfume is, opium, I think is the way to go. That's it lives up to its name. It has a lot of the kind of notes we look for there. For Baudelaire, I think you should smell all of the base notes and correspondence. Find some musk, find some benzoin, find some incense, find some ambergris. You can buy these wonderful little testers from perfume making companies.
Thank you so much. This has been delightful. I hope I did you all justice in the audience. These were great questions. And like I said, if you haven't had a chance to dive deeply, it really is, what is it? It's a gritty optimism. It's a gritty pleasure. It's one that doesn't shy away from the troubling parts of the world, but also reminds us that there's joy and beauty in the body and life. And so
thank you.
We need that now more than ever. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Holly and Cheryl. This was such a great conversation. The questions on the chat are so great and rich and wonderful. So I invite everybody to stick around, turn your cameras on, and we can, continue to discuss informally. And I can't wait to get my hands on my copy.